really want to start by just saying thank you very much to Rachel and the conference organisers for inviting me today. It feels quite a privilege and to do so, and it also feels quite a strange experience for me. There are plenty of people inside this audience who have known me, and one or two of them have known me before I was even a social worker. So there are people here who have known me for 20, 25 years, and it seems quite strange to be making that journey and stood up here and being asked to, and I'll go on to say and talk about the things that I'm going to talk about, but it seems very strange to be doing that. And it almost feels like I'm doing a tale of two double poacher-turned gamekeepers. So at one level, yes, now I suppose I work for the university, as Sally said. I'm a senior lecturer in social work. I still find it quite hard to introduce myself as a researcher in alcohol and drug and social care related activities, but that is what I do, that is what my job is now, and that is what I write about and even get published about. Seems a very strange experience in the sense of it will have been no more than 3 or 4 years ago. I would have certainly been sat in the chairs as one of those people involved as a practitioner and a manager in the same issues that you're trying to deal with now. You know, it's only 2.5 years ago I was strategic area manager for North Wales Probation Service and responsible for all the drug and alcohol issues that we had to deal with. So that feels like a strange journey. The second part of the poacher turned gamekeeper, I have to be slightly mindful of now. So Sally has mentioned about being filmed and the likelihood of this going on YouTube, and I've willingly given my consent. But Sally also jokingly suggested about why it is that I might know some police colleagues in the room. And I do have a past that precedes my journey into social work, and that does involve police busting down my door looking for drugs in my house. And I'm quite happy to offer both of those contexts, even though it's a bit reluctant for that necessarily to go on film. But I think it's important in relation to the conversation I'm going to say with you today. Because at the heart of the conversation I'm going to talk about today is the belief in and the possibility and the understanding of change. That's at the core of successful interventions in terms of child protection with people with mental health, or parents with mental health concerns, experiences, and the same for drug and alcohol. And whilst I come from a drug and alcohol perspective, and that's the title of the piece, I'm going to try and talk from both perspectives. And just before I start, I wanted to say that actually 2 or 3 people in this room were somewhere else yesterday with a different 120 people in a room in a conference. And that room was about 30, 40 practitioners tops, and maybe 80 alcohol and drug users, all in long-term stable recovery. Yes. And when you see that, as we saw yesterday, it's an incredibly powerful message about that belief in people's ability to change. But I'll say some more about that. Okay, we have a long hour, and you'll be glad to know I don't intend to talk for an hour. I get very bored at the sound of my own voice after a while, and I know those of you who know me know that will happen as well. So I'm going to try and talk for around 40 or 45 minutes, but no more than that. And it's very much my intention to leave 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes for those sort of questions. If not, you'll get a more, if no one's got any questions, you'll get your more extended coffee break, presumably for networking, which is the other purpose of being here. But if people don't want to ask me questions about the stuff that I ask here, obviously I'm doing a workshop as well, and I will extend those conversations into a slightly smaller space. But I intend to do 3 things really. One, I want to briefly talk about the context of why we're here, why I've been invited, why this subject matter is so crucial, work of safeguarding boards and the wider child protection agenda. And I want to suggest that when I get to the end of that, that poses two areas for us to look at. And there are two evidence-based conversations that are beginning to, or increasingly emerging, that we need to have a think about. And one of those is issues to do with risk and how we perceive and discuss risk. And the second of those is about what are the effective interventions to do with this client group that can improve the chances of family functioning. And family functioning is at the heart of making children safe. If I say anything that someone doesn't understand, I'm quite content to be interrupted as well. So I want to start really with a story about Kelly and Gary. And Kelly and Gary are a couple whom I worked with 15, 18 years ago. Probably 1997, 1998. A very long time ago anyway. And Kelly was a 19-year-old pregnant intravenous drug user. And she was working with services, the people who were involved, and including myself. And not untypically, she was struggling, find it incredibly difficult. Gary, her partner, and I'm not sure natural long-term partner, but compelled partner through the pregnancy. And it's always interesting that people don't always make those choices. Gary had a degree of learning disabilities, kept down a really good job in a garage as a mechanic, but struggled with some of the issues. And I got involved in working with Kelly because Kelly was unable to stick to her prescribing regime. And she was being prescribed injectable heroin by a consultant psychiatrist whilst pregnant as the only way to keep the baby stable inside the womb. And I got involved in those circumstances. But after a lot of work, three things happened that meant now, or the last time I spoke to Kelly and Gary, their eldest daughter is not that far off going to university. They are still together as a couple. They have two other children. And three things happened early on that enabled them to then live their own family life without the support of professionals. And the first of those was the granting of time and to spend time with them. And I spent a lot of time with them, and I wasn't alone. There were just two of us. And we spent large quantities of time with them, building relationships, building trust, such that we could actually find out where the injectable drugs were. There were all sorts of things that went on. The second, and most interestingly, I think, was the involvement of Gary's family and not Kelly's. Gary's family had not been involved in their relationship, had not been involved in the initial conversations. And the extension of that support provided the first and the most substantive safety framework. And very interestingly, because you'll see this is really intrinsic to the story I'm going to tell you, Kelly, who'd been sexually abused on more than one occasion in her childhood, and was quite a chronic self-harmer, and indeed we could view her injecting drug use as only a different form of self-harm, worked with myself and a female health worker and two other young people, and we actually worked through, for about 2 or 3 years, established a self-help, self-harm support group for young women. And that support group was a huge fundamental journey. Now, I introduced this story because of the length of time it was ago, and the evidence I'm going to finish talking to you about says that some of these things and characteristics are what make a difference. And I suppose I'm saying that what I'm going to tell you is nothing new. it's actually what we've always been doing. It actually accounts for the 40,000 children that don't end up on the Child Protection Register. But of course, it's also at the heart about how we reduce the number of people on the Child Protection Register as well. So the conversations I'm going to give you are about both sides of that equation. You know, what do we need to do to continue to ensure that the number of people on the Child Protection Register doesn't grow, and how do we work out and do more effective work with those children on it? And they're two slightly different considerations. But let's get back to the context, because we know why we're here. Yes, I noticed that Barbara's doing a workshop later called The Elephant in the Room. Sometimes for me this is the elephant in the room. The fear amongst the professionals, and that's all of us in the organisation, that we are the next Sun headlines. We have the next Victoria Columbia on our patch. Yes? You know? And that's, it's a hugely driving, fearful experience. Some of the work that's come out of these type of events, of course, actually accounts for the existence of local children's safeguarding partnerships. They are in part a response to these situations. Yeah. And at one level, it's rightly so. No one in society, and nor should we, want another Victoria Columbia, baby P. Yes? Okay? So it's right that we're here. It's right that that pressure is on us. But one of the conversations I'm going to take you through is that that pressure in itself has an impact on the work that we do. And we need to think about that and how we respond to that. And in the first of the two conversations I'm going to say, it really is having a significant impact, according to the evidence and the emerging research, on the nature of the interpretation of risk and the way we practice. Okay. Something about what I'm not going to say something too much about. Okay? Parents with significant mental health problems, parents with very significant use of alcohol and or drugs, and we would add to this, I feel, a third group that's not on the top title here, but families where there's a high level of interrelationship domestic violence, which often spills over in relation to these things. There is a welter of evidence, which I'm not going to talk about today, which we all know, because that's why we're in business, yes, that results in harm to children. That's not up for debate. I'm not here to say that that doesn't happen. That is the starting point. We have a primary objective to protect, and that needs to take place. Drug and alcohol results in both abuse and neglect, and you all know this. It results in stifled child development, attendance at school, behavioural problems of children, malnutrition, lack of appropriate physical development. We know this stuff, and the evidence base is absolutely ginormous. What we also know, which reflects perhaps the second part of the conversation that I want to have with you, is that that damage doesn't just stop there and then with that child. Yes? So the really important thing is, it leads to, as in my story with Kelly, yes, it leads to that behaviour being taken into adulthood. And frequently, of course, and you're all experiencing this, it leads to intergenerational problems. Yes? And so one of the struggles we're having is very often and increasingly with children of children that we've already seen through in previous generations. And we also have to think about, well, how do we get to a place that stops that? Because that's about the protection of future children as well as the protection of the here and now. And those become incredibly difficult balancing acts for the services, you know, and the authorities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I come back to the Children's Act. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about too much of this. This is not the focus of this presentation. This is the given. This is the thing that we already accept. This is the reason why we're existing. But we do have to ask ourselves this question. This becomes a very important question. How many inquiries? Now, some people in this room, as opposed to other people, depending on the length of your practitioner's basis, will remember going far back as a Colwell, and we're now talking 40 years. Whilst the last one up here, the Francis inquiry, is not child protection or safeguarding, it's adult safeguarding because of what happened in the North Staffordshire Hospital. And it seems to me that this is not going to stop. I anticipate or imagine that at some point in time there will be a public inquiry and a report and a set of recommendations following what's gone on with Jimmy Savile. So these things are going to come and they're going to come and they're going to come and come again, yes? And what I also want to suggest is that it's not unique to us. Those of you who are not aware, the same kind of reports and recommendations come in other countries. Yes? This is not something unique to us. So it begs the question, which is the first point I really want to make out of the evidence, and this is that first evidence marker, it begs questions whether or not we can ever reach a point of total protection. And we probably can't. Yes? We can strive, but we probably can't. And that means that we're always going to be wandering around with the fear of does the one that we can't do happen on our patch. Of course, what all of those inquiries, and perhaps is most interesting or most disturbing, and what is beginning to be reflected in a lot of new literature and evidence, is that they talk about more communication, more information sharing, more training, more procedure, more monitoring, and more support. That is the rationale for local children's safeguarding boards. It's the rationale for various reorganisations that occur within organisations. It's the rationale for increasingly multi-agency perspectives. Yeah? And you would conclude that after 40 years, that if we were able to hear those recommendations and we were able to follow them through absolutely logically, explicitly, or everything else, that we'd end up with no child protection caseloads. Yet at the moment we're in a framework where actually child protection caseloads, if anything, are slightly increasing. Yes? And the pressure and the monitoring performances for more numbers of child protection caseloads and not less. Yes? And there's an inherent contradiction in that position. And really what I want to do for my presentation is explore that inherent contradiction. Yes? Why is it, and what might be the explanations, what might be the additional things that we have to do? We have to assume at some point in time that these messages have been heard. We have local children's safeguarding board partnerships. We have multi-agency agreements. We have information sharing protocols. We have increasingly single databases which we all put our information on. We have client records that are shared amongst everybody. Well, at what point in time will we keep doing more and more of this stuff, and yet maybe the context and the other issues doesn't change? And that really suggests that we also need to have some other conversations. And if you, and I did start by saying that obviously my job's changed and I've started to have to look at different things over the last 4 or 5 years, and if you spend, and it is a privilege and I really enjoy it, if you spend like I do an awful lot of time immersing yourself in research, literature and evidence, and journal dialogues and all sorts of things like that, what you will see is an emerging conversation that says, okay, we need to keep doing this stuff, but what else? What's going to make a difference? And I will talk to you about this at 2 levels, really. I'm going to talk to you about this at one level about the risk management agenda, and then at the second level about the interventions agenda for working with family and service users. And I'll come back to the intervention stuff. Okay. So, I'm asking these questions in my presentation, and then I guess I'm asking these questions for you to think about, to take away into your practice, take away into the workshops, whatever else. If we're getting better and better at responding to the demands of the inquiries, yes, and we are, you know, this room is evidence of that, yes, then why do things keep happening still? Why do children still keep ending up on the Child Protection Register? Why do we still keep getting significant cases from time to time? And then the moment you ask that question, why, it then suggests to you, well, what can be done differently? And it is my personal take, and it is only my personal take, and it can only ever be a personal take, despite the fact that I'm trying to be as objective as I can with literature and evidence. I think this is, I think this is about questions of perspectives on risk and perspectives on interventions. And I use those words perspectives very guidedly. So 2 notes about the evidence base, because at one level this is an evidence-based conversation I'm giving to you, and at another level, as I've said to you, this is a personal-based conversation, because I am a part, and have been a part, and continue to be a part of the community and the conversation that's going on in this room. 2 notes really. When we use the word evidence-based, it's always up for challenge. And again, I'm not here to have that kind of conversation, but actually there is no such thing as 100% evidence. People, you know, and it's now my job as researchers, like to tell you that's what we've done. We haven't. Essentially, research and or government policy documents and stuff, it goes and looks for something and hopes to find what it looks for. That doesn't mean that's necessarily what's there. It means it's what they've looked for. And you always have to remember that when you think about these things. The second is, I have provided to Rachel, and Rachel will make that available after the conference, yes. I have provided people with a 2-page list of where they can get the sources that I begin to refer to, and I'll make a comment at the end about how I will make myself available to people to follow these conversations through. So please access it yourself and form your own views. Don't just take it as my interpretation is the correct interpretation, because it's not necessarily, it's my interpretation. Okay, so I like to use this slide when I have a first conversation about risk, and I think it's an important one for me to use, because it associates issues of myth and culture about risk. We hear stories, don't we, about local authorities that ban conkers in schools and chop down conker trees for falling on people's heads and stuff. And I don't need to say any more. It suddenly invokes all sorts of conversations in you about a madness of interpretation in society with risk. Yes? And of course, the most classic example for me is we go and buy cups of coffee from shops now with plastic lids on that tell you, caution, the thing is hot. Well, if it wasn't hot, we'd sue them for selling us cold products. You know, so we have so we know the context, and this is the big context. Okay, so everything that I have said so far suggests that one of the first things that we're struggling with, and the evidence and the literature will talk about this, is this question of whose risk is taking priority in the way we organise and function. Yes? And the critique that is suggested at the moment is that it's actually the organisation, the managers and the employees' risk that is being looked after first. That's the explanation why the practitioners in the room feel that their job has drifted over the last 10 to 12 years as more and more time filling in boxes, filling in pieces of paper, not being able to spend time with people, not being able to form relationships, and just monitoring. This is the accountability conversation. And so one of the things that a lot of the evidence research is talking about is saying, how does that impact on the practice outcomes? Now, I'm not making a judgment. I'm offering you the much more basic point that how we orientate ourselves and which risk hierarchy we decide is the most important which drives the way we practice, results in different practice outcomes. Yes? So if the primary agenda is protection of the agency first and protection of the children second, and I'm not suggesting that's what happens, but I'm suggesting to you that literature and research is beginning to look at that as an explanation for the amount of time people and practitioners are spending with the people they need to be spending, then clearly it means that service users, children, families, carers and the public become lower down on the priority, and it affects the orientation of our service. You know, and so one of the challenges, of course, for everybody in this room is actually how do we balance both of those demands equally. Sally does not wish to become the next Karen Shoesmith, and that is perfectly understandable. No one would want to be pilloried in the sun like that. A reasonable position to reach. Yes? But we have also somehow got to remain focused on our job. So, there's a lot of discourse going on at the moment in the literature about how we balance these two acts. Okay, and it translates itself down into two themes. Predominantly two themes, and I've chosen these two themes to explore with you. The first is, how do we balance the demands of control management with partnership? And that's both within the agency, so that's within this room. How do we balance the demands of the agency and control management of staff and monitoring and paperwork rather than a genuine partnership relationship between everybody? And of course that's a conversation in our work with service users and families and carers and children. You know, how do we balance the demands of needing to control and monitor the behaviour they're doing in order to minimise the risks and processes of accountability, along with all of the other stuff, and we've only got to look at the Social Services Care Bill that was published in Wales within the last sort of month, that is encouraging us to engage in more and more partnership type work. You know, these are very, very difficult balancing acts. But, and I've given you some examples, and you'll see on a number of slides I've boxed off some evidence, and what Rachel will provide you is where this evidence is, so you can draw your own conclusions by looking at the literature. There is an increasing evidence-based call for frontline professionals to be supported and empowered to take informed risks. So the accountability agenda has got us to a place where maybe some of those risks that you as practitioners are taking have been a little bit stifled, and the conversation is saying, how do we achieve that balancing act correctly? And it is a balancing act, because we must not overtake risks at the expense of causing harm to children. And the reason for this, once you start to look into the evidence and discourse about risk, of course, is that taking risk is the means by which we promote growth and change. Too much stifling and management of risk means there is no growth and there is no change. It will only lead us down in one route. So we have to have a look about that. That is best summarised for me in this particular piece of work by Stanford, but I could have given you very many, in which Stanford suggests that there is a rhetoric of risk, and he's quite clear, or she's quite clear, the same way as that I am, that comes from the wider societal conversation. It's not necessarily the one that's inside this room, it's the one that we're subject to the pressure of. It creates a fear, yes. It clashes with the values that we want to work at, yes. It's driven by politics. You know, there are people in this room, senior managers in this room, who are accountable to dispatches. Local council dispatch box delivery or parliamentary dispatch delivery, yes? And at some point in time that can genuinely affect attempts to respond to need. And it's something to do with how workers' practice becomes fearful. So if that's one of the things, the second of the things is about trying to move away from deficit-based approach to strengths. What's common to both of these things is a move to working in partnership and away from a paternalistic base. And there have been lots of dialogues, and what strikes me is that these are not new as well. These messages are over 20 years old in government legislation. And at the heart of them, they talk about an honest use of power. So it's an honest use of power within this room, and then it's an honest use of power when we're outside with the people that we work with. We have to use that power. We have to exercise it. It's about how we do it. Second of those things, as I said before, and a very strong, and this is one of the things that is becoming an increasing evidence-based thing, and we know about this because this is at the heart of Welsh Government policy. You know, this is the explanation for integrated family support services, amongst other things, is a move to a safety-orientated approach for child protection work. Yes? And aligned with a safety approach is a strengths-based approach. Yes? And really what affects this is, at times, our position towards the abuse that we see. In other words, whether or not we blame individuals for it happening, or whether we, whilst not condoning it, see it symptomatic of a context that those families are living in. Yes? It's about whether or not we concentrate on the times it does happen, or whether we're able to concentrate on the times that it doesn't happen, whether or not we're able to see the families we work with as being capable of change, and what are the strengths, what are the things they're doing well. Yes? And it requires the workforce to have a willingness and a capacity and confidence, this idea of belief in change. And the evidence is saying that how we go about our business can affect those outcomes as much as what's going on for those families. In other words, we can be a significant factor in the outcome for those children, not just the families. That becomes a really important point. Okay. This is a very complicated conversation, but if we reduced it to a very simple conversation, what all of that evidence and literature is saying is we can ask families two choices, two questions, when a child doesn't attend a day at school. And this is how it's summarised. It's very flippant and simply, this example, but this is how it's summarised. And you know, I expect you to understand it and take that back into a really complicated position, but we can have the conversation and say to them, why wasn't Mickey at school on Friday? That's a deficit-based conversation and interaction with them. Yes? Or we can have the choice, not denying the fact that Mickey wasn't in school on Friday, but say, and have the conversation about how they've succeeded in getting him there on the other 4 days. It's a simple reorientation of the way in which we work with those people. Yeah? That sounds really simplistic, but that's how it works. Yeah? Okay. And so, for those of you who are not familiar with some of those models, what it requires is, and you'll see on this slide, that this slide takes account of a number of situations that we as practitioners would expect to get involved in, and considerations. And what it says to you is, in all the considerations you do in your child protection and safeguarding work, do it with a duality. Don't forget the harms where I started. We mustn't ignore those, we must consider those, but every time we make a point or a reference to harm, ask ourselves what the opposite side of the equation is. Yes? And that's what the model says. It's a very, very simple model, and it requires these two dominant things, partnership and strength-based approaches, become at the heart of these. And what it says is that we mix the harms, danger and safety together. We don't get dominated by the left-hand side only. We don't get dominated by the left-hand side. We mix it with what we know as professional knowledge, but if we're working in partnership, we give as much weight to family and community perspectives as well. And we fuse these four things, and we come up with a much more different approach. And the argument is being that at times we are too ski-whiffed towards the bottom south-east perspective of this diagram, and we want, so it's that kind of conversation. I like to see it this way. Yes? What's the risk in the photograph? Hmm? The drink. The drink is not the risk. The drink is not the risk. What's the risk in the photograph? Of falling off the tightrope. The drink is the complication. Clearly you're potentially more likely to fall off if you drink. But you're not necessarily guaranteed to. Yes, but you are at some level or another potentially guaranteed to fall off a tightrope if you continue to walk on a tightrope. Yeah? And that's the way it summarises the change of the way we need to understand and look at our perspectives. That's what this stuff talks about. It means we have to very accurately and get very skilled at understanding what are genuine risks of the situation and protect children from those, but actually reassess our views of the context in which it takes place. Yeah? What becomes even more interesting is that we don't even know that there's any alcohol inside the bottle. Okay, so that really is one half of my conversation, and the bridge between this conversation, for me, is this particular slide, really. So we've got to do a balancing act between the children and the complication factors. In this instance, alcohol and drugs, but there are a whole range of complicated factors. Yes, and we have to walk a balancing act between protection, minimisation and prevention. And the critique or the evidence base will say when we're struggling a little bit, we're a little bit top heavy. And before we had local children's safeguarding boards, the partnerships and everything else, if anything, we were bottom heavy. You know, we were too preoccupied with prevention and individuals and weren't taking account of the key things that we need to be accountable of and making people safe. And it is a balancing act. It's why the tightrope is such a lovely picture to think about. And I want to talk to you about the interventions that can make a difference at the individual or the family level. But they are not the only ones. We have a whole number of health colleagues in this room who in another part of their life are really interested in the whole population approaches to this equation. And so an example of a whole population approach, which is not a conversation for this room, but is a conversation out there in society at the moment, is whether or not we should have minimum pricing. Yeah? So minimum pricing will result in, according to some reasonably sound evidence, if I can use that, it will result in a reduction in the number of people that end up dying on liver wards. That goes the argument, that goes the evidence. Those kind of whole population interventions don't necessarily mean that an individual drinker will not be one of the people that dies on that ward. Does that make sense? So the first part of our conversation is the risk stuff. It's the local children's safeguarding board, and it's the management and everything else. It's the policies, it's the procedures. Those are the whole population issues. Those are the matters, yes, that the more and more we do them, we might reach the position of increasing the gaps between the Victoria Columbiers and the baby P. So I don't think we'll ever remove them. And it might be where we get to the position of taking Sally's number from 130 down to 95 or 50. But we don't genuinely believe that we'll get to a place where there will be 0. Yes? So the other half of my presentation is really about what can we do in this room with the people that we then get left with, both the 130 and the 40,000. And what is the stuff that's going to make the difference to the individual and families that we're working with, perhaps than what might be the overall total populations. And they are two conversations for us. And I hope that makes sense. Is that clear about them being two conversations? Yeah. Okay. So I want to tell you a second story, very, very briefly. Jenny and John, and I've put John in brackets because our whole child protection conversation treats fathers in brackets. And you should know what I mean by that. They are peripheral player. We expect somehow the mother to do the protecting. And if we're lucky, we'll have a father involved in the conversation. But we don't always implicitly bring them into the conversation. We might argue on another level they don't wish to be involved in the conversation. Okay? So, but Jenny and John have 2 children together. And Jenny has 2 other children from 2 different fathers before she ever met John. Only 2 of the 4 children have children and family social workers. Yes? The eldest child, Jack, yeah, who has been having some truancy and attendance problem at school, and the youngest child, Joe, yes, who has a range of physical disabilities and has a very specific social worker from a physical disability team. Jenny is a violent drinker. She has an alcohol worker, and she's involved with the criminal justice system, and there are police call-outs when she engages in acts of domestic violence towards John. Yeah? John has some mental health problems, and he himself has a different community psychiatric nurse. That's not a fantasy picture I've just portrayed you. Most of you would probably even think, I know that family. Yes? I hope you don't, because I've just made that up. But you might think that you do. I've just described 12 people in this room who are likely to be involved with that family. Plus, and I haven't referred to, maybe the same number again who work for intervention and support work role teams associated with all those different agencies. 24 people involved in a family, yes, and not one person providing a substantive intervention, everyone providing lots of bits. There's a lot of call about the evidence about how do we make that change. We know the biggest call for that is the IFSS, but there are many other examples. So, what I want to highlight for you really is three things from this issue about how do we more effectively work with families, what can you do in the room, what are the signposts for the most effective interventions. And these interventions, I said before, apply really both for child protection cases, but those that have not yet got there, they apply around mental health, they apply around drugs, and in some contexts, they apply to domestic abuse. And there are three. The evidence base for effective alcohol and drug interventions is ginormous. And I'm not having that conversation about the evidence base for methadone, for example. But it sits there. That's not this conversation. These are the ones that are focused in the social care, family, child protection environment. And they are threefold, really. One, they talk about the nature of our relationships with service users. Families. The second, they talk about the fact that how do we get away from the Jenny and John model of work, where we treat everybody and everyone is treated as an individual in that context, and work with families. And the third thing is saying, well, actually what happens when we all pack up at 5 o'clock on a Friday night and go home to bed? What happens when we close the case to stop the revolving door? And they're the three really interesting bits of evidence that we might want to have a look at. What's really, really interesting, and I've just recently done a fairly systematic review of the evidence with Dr. Sarah Galvani for one of those pieces of work that weirdly is going to get published. And what you can draw across all of this stuff is that it all got the same things, the same qualities, and what it says is the most effective agent of change is not what we do, but how we do it. And it's about relationship building, empathy, communication skills, active listening, non-empowering attitude, non-judgmental attitudes. And I guess most people in this room would say, I do that. Well, let's just keep doing more of it. If you wanted the single piece of evidence base that might talk about it, well, United Kingdom Alcohol Treatment Trial did a comparative investigation on interventions with over 13,000 alcohol users comparing two different modalities of intervention and could find no discernible difference. The only discernible difference between the outcomes was the quality of the relationship and nature of the worker. The worker was the common denominator. Okay, so what does the evidence say about the worker-based stuff? And as you say, I'm not myself highlighting all these evidence down the bottom. I'm handing it to you. I'm just telling you what I think the summary of it says. Well, at the relationship level, it says two things. Once we've done these basic common qualities, everyone in this room should be able to get engaged with significant advice and brief interventions. Yes? and engage in a skilled level of motivational interviewing. And you can find out a lot more about what these interventions say, but essentially they talk about is providing information. And the providing of information by the worker that's working with them in the here and now, rather than referring them to someone else to provide information that you're capable of giving. Information to tell people to cut down is easily given by anybody, with just a tiny bit of support. Yes? And the second of those matters is to help folk consider to change. Let's not assume that people can't. And then within those conversations we have to make and enable people to make choices and support decision making. And we do some of that stuff well. And for a very small number of people we work with, that's actually the decision as quickly as possible to let go of the children. Yes? To say, I can't parent. But for the majority, it's the opposite. But they're very difficult. Yes? But the point that the evidence base increasingly says is this is stuff that the people in the room should be doing. Yes? To some degree or another, this is not the stuff that we require CICE or a drug service for. We require them for other, much more specialist interventions. Not this. We need to be doing this ourselves. For people who want to find out a little bit more about this, particularly, I would recommend above all else at the moment the Alcohol Learning Centre as a website, and the reference will be there for you, but you can just type that into Google and it will take you to a whole range of understanding these things. Okay. Secondly, families. I've been asking myself this question ever since I was trained, along with two people in this, or three people in this room, three, I can't see, there's at least two of us have trained, three of us have trained together. I've been asking this question, how much more evidence do we need before we truly implement the Children Act? And there are three actually, there are four of us in the room that trained together. In fact, it might be five, I keep seeing people. Okay, the Children's Act was very deliberately written with prevention as part 3 and protection as part 4, and not the other way round. The key to successful protection is successful prevention. Yeah? And these are very difficult balancing acts, but we have to ask ourselves that question. And what the literature is beginning to say about family interventions is that's what we need to be doing. Effective, early, preventative interventions. Really difficult challenges for the senior managers in this room. If they're really to seriously do it, they have to take eggs out of the protection bucket of resources for which they're being held accountable for and put them in the prevention ones. Yes? For which they only shall do rather than must do, according to the legislation. It's a huge fundamental challenge. We can summarise the literature very, very easily, and this is my summary, yes. All the literature about family stuff says that we need to be engaging in interventions that need to work in partnership with the families. It's really important, this partnership stuff. Using the critical moment of children's referral. So this is the moment of the referral. We waste those moments far too often, according to the evidence base. We finally do in-depth, meaningful intervention works with people when we've had 10, 12 referrals. 2 child protection conferences. They've been off, they've come back, they've been through the revolving door. It's too late. It's too late. Yes? And we need to support parents at those moments before it's escalated, to accentuate the positives, yes, for changing their behaviour. And you notice it's the behaviour that we're concerned with, the parenting behaviour. Yes? And then we'll be very effective. Yeah? And the evidence base is huge. It's been there for a long time now. And some of you will recognise these. Home builders, very much a strength-based evidence approach. Option 2, been running for 10 years in Cardiff, precursor to the IFSS. Very much talking about critical crisis moments. You'll know that the IFSS is there. UCAT did social behaviour and network therapy, which is about extending the support and using carers. We've got a whole wealth of stuff from Capello and Orford about a 5-step model. You have someone in this room, in terms of Barbara, the current but soon-to-be ex-Dart manager, I guess, given what's going on. Who knows stuff about craft, and another very effective intervention. And we have had for a number of years in Conwy, an example of trying to do this piece of work. Yes, the evidence base is there. It's almost unequivocal now, and it almost suggests why we're doing what we're doing. And I really do pose the question now, from my position as a researcher and academic. At what point in time are we going to allocate single social workers to whole families and not single social workers to the adults in one place and children in the other place? Yes, until we get that moment of coordination, at what moment will we get the effective intervention? I deliberately pose that question. Yes, what does the literature say these things have in common? Well, the beauty about them is that they not only help the person, yes, who's got the drug or alcohol or mental health problem, but the other family members. And of course, the more support we provide to the other family members, we already know that they are the strength and the safeguard for the children, not the one using. Yeah, it's in our interest to get involved with those people as much as possible. They're the cheap, easy wins for us in our business. And I use that language deliberately and provocatively. The moment we start to have family and behavioural parenting interventions rather than the other kind of conversation that reduces us to substance misuse and hair follicle testing, we get to a place where we are really interested in the impact beyond the presenting problem. And what we all want is family functioning. And we use this, of course, in conjunction with the thing that I've introduced earlier, a reinterpretation of our perspective on risks and strength building. Yes? One of the complications this tells you, of course, is actually impossible to assess families. Those of us that know about, we know we can't do static assessments, and we're driven to try and do static assessments, and we can't. And somehow we're going to have to really consider about how we balance those two requirements. Yes? A unified assessment tells us something at a moment in time. The information and the stuff that may inform that will be completely different within 2 weeks. Assessment is almost impossible now, if we want to get in those considerations. Yes, we just agree that we start to work with someone and we live with very, very live assessments. Okay, the very final thing I want to say then is really about sustainability. We will walk away. Whether we are successful or unsuccessful, we will walk away. At some point in time, children will move into one place, or they'll be safe where they are and we walk away. But families have to continue to build with their life. And there is an increasing amount of evidence, and very much more focused in the substance misuse world, and most people in the substance misuse world will know this, that there is a huge conversation about what is family, peers and community support. And what we're actively being asked to consider is that it is beyond this idea that we have of a worker sitting in a room with 5 people having a chat in a group. Group intervention is very effective for behavioural change. It is not the thing for long-term sustained change. And the literature talks us about that. So, much more specifically, we have to embrace things that we've always not been quite clear about what we should be embracing. So things like self-help organisations. We need to actually consider, yes, and work out how many people we've got who are actually engaged in AA and NA. There are all sorts of recovery initiatives out there. You will see policies dominated by recovery. I started this conversation by saying it's absolutely possible. 120 people in a room yesterday, all sober, functioning, getting on with their lives. This stuff is possible, providing each other a support network. And if you wanted any evidence base about the long-term sustainable role that peers, communities, non-professionals might have in impacting on change and contributing to a safeguarding agenda, well then we don't have to look any further than the COSA model. So for those of you who don't know anything about COSA, it's the Circles of Support and Accountability, which works and supports sex offenders, and it has ridiculous evidence-based outcomes for reoffending compared to those not engaged with it. It's frightening evidence-based as it stands at the moment. And we need to extend beyond, but once we extend beyond, we actually have to consider how we invite that part of the world back into our partnership conversation. So we have a conversation in this room that limits the definitions of what we might think is the service providers and the interveners and the people who might help. And I'm going to say something a little bit more about that with my conclusion. Okay. So there is plenty of evidence about effective interventions. So what does this peer and community stuff do? Well, actually it does stuff that we can't do in this room in quite the same way. It offers role models. It can offer 24/7 support. It offers direct peer challenge. Direct peer challenge is evidenced to be hugely effective, far more effective than when it comes from us as professionals. Yes? It can fill the voids. If people are to change their behaviour, they have voids that need filling, because their behaviour is symptomatic of other stuff. It's not just problematic, it's always symptomatic as well. They have to fill the voids. Yes? And of course, it's safer socialisation. It's hanging around with people that are sober, are doing things, are functioning. And the alternative to safer socialisation, and you'll hear this time and time again, is people staring at four walls in a flat. And that will only build pressure to return to their ways of behaving. And there are very clear messages from the evidence of what's your role in all of this. To have knowledge of these other service providers. Yes? To believe in them. To support people to participate. It's not risky. The evidence quite clearly says it's not risky for other drug users to be supported by sober, clean drug users. Let's not be frightened of them mixing with the community that's making the change. Yes, as opposed to the one that's not. And in some instances where there isn't a self-help group, well, let's set one up. Let's set a group up for parents, and so on and so forth. Let's do that stuff. Okay, I said I would finish, and I will finish. So, what are the messages? The concluding thoughts are really that this stuff does harm, we know that. Safeguarding is really important, but perhaps we need to also consider how we balance the pressures on us. And is it protection plus prevention, or does, and I only pose the question, does it almost need to be prevention plus protection? Where's the priorities for us all as organisations to get to that place? Yes? We have to have a new framework of risk, yes, and that has to be trusting the people we work with, but actually that's our organisations trusting you. And that's a message for the practitioners in the room. Yes? There are effective interventions, change is very much possible, and we need to both have knowledge of them and belief in them. But at the heart of them is moving away from individualised, pathologised interventions into strong relationship-built, relationship-based ones that work with whole families. And for me, that makes the question about who's missing in the room. I suppose I'm interested about where are the families in the room that we've taken the children off? Where are the families in the room we've supported? Where are the children who have been in looked after care? Where are the people who can contribute to the conversations that we really need to have as well? Because these are not just our conversations, they're their conversations, they're collective conversations. Last but not least, we're in Glyndwr University. I work for Glyndwr University, and we need to bridge the divide between theory and academia. Those are my contact details. I am available for anybody in this room, any point in time, for anything that I have said. You just have to ask. If you want a piece of knowledge or a piece of thing that you can't get hold of, do it. People do it. They email and say, well, have you got some literature on such and such? And I will find it for people and give it to them. We have to have informed practice. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me.